obviously the three little pigs, right? And you know the story of the three little pigs. Two of the pigs built their houses out of disposable stuff, renewable stuff, green stuff. And the other pig used bricks. And the thing about the three little pigs is the wolf is always at your door. The wolf is always going to be at your door. And it's the same in the church. The wolf is always going to be at the door, trying to blow us down. He's always going to be trying to divide us, always trying to separate us and all of that things. And that's why Jesus said in Matthew chapter 7, starting at verse 24, anyone who listens to my teaching and follows it is wise, like a person who builds a house on a solid rock. And though the rain comes in torrents and the floodwaters rise and the winds beat against the house, it won't collapse because it is built on bedrock. But anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on sand. And when the rains and the floods come and the winds beat against the house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. You've got to have a good foundation. You've got to have a good foundation for yourself. You've got to have a good foundation for your family. You've got to have a good foundation for your church. Author Gordon Hinckley said this, you can't build a great building on a weak foundation. You must have a solid foundation if you're going to have a strong superstructure. Listen to me this morning. Weak churches are built on weak foundations. Weak churches are built on weak foundations. And that's why we've been studying all of this stuff the last few weeks about different foundations, the right foundations for functional churches, because we don't want to be a dysfunctional church. We want to be a functional church. We want to be a church where we get along and where we make the difference for Jesus Christ. And so in the last few weeks, we've been looking at some of these things. We must be a community of unity. We must be a family of structure which brings a sense of safety to the body of Christ. And we must be a functional church which is a family that offers direction through God's Word. And so we move on this morning to the fourth foundation of a functional church, and that is this. It is a family of shared standards. It is a family of shared standards. I'm sure you and I both watch the news, and we wonder how in the world some people get elected because they act like 6-year-olds. How does the world settle and establish what's right or wrong for our culture today? Well, mostly if you watch the news, it's by shouting at each other and demeaning each other's character, calling each other's names until the loudest one wins, even when that definition of moral right or moral standard is wrong for the culture. A lot of times, if you're like me and you watch the politicians and you watch the people on TV shouting each other, go home today and turn on one of the news shows and you'll see them shouting each other. It reminds me of a cartoon. And you know which cartoon I'm talking about, this one.
No, it's duck hunting season. That, sir, is an investigated fabrication. It's wabbit season. Duck season. Wabbit season. Duck season. Wabbit season. Duck season. Wabbit season. Wabbit season. Duck season. Wabbit season. I say it's duck season, and I say fire. Let's try that again. Okay, I'll start it this time. Right. Wabbit season. Duck season. Wabbit season. Wabbit season. Duck season. Fire! Okay, this time you start it. Whatever you say. Wabbit. Duck fire!
It breaks my heart that there's an entire generation in the 90s that didn't get to see that. What have we done to our children? I don't know. Anyway, I digress. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. People argue back and forth and they shout at each other and finally the shotgun goes off and it just blows some people away. Knowing right and wrong is important in life. You understand that, I understand that. But whose version of right and wrong do you adopt? Do you adopt Ottawa's version of what's right and wrong? Do you adopt Hollywood's version of what's right and wrong? How about your university professor? Do you adopt their version of what's right and wrong? See, the functional church is a family. In the functional church, families clear up a lot of chaos and confusion by sharing the same moral standards. And the reason that we have the same moral standards is because they come from the book. We talked about this last week. This is the book where our moral standards are found. And so if we all read this, if we all agree this is the Word of God, then our moral standards should be the same. It comes from the teaching of Christ and the apostles. Christian philosopher Francis Schaeffer said this: the moral absolutes, and by moral absolutes he just means what's right and what's wrong, the moral absolutes rest upon God's character. The moral commands he has given to men are an expression of his character. Men, as created in his image, are to live by choice on the basis of what God is. The standards of morality are determined by what conforms to his character, while those things which do not conform to his character are immoral. What he's simply saying there is this, is that the moral code, the right and wrong that we live by, is dependent and consistent with God's character. If what we believe is right, if what we believe is wrong, is inconsistent with God's character, with what's in the book, then it is immoral. And it's a very simple thing to figure out. And so we understand that we need a moral code because of what we need. Now, a standard, we've talked about standards. A standard is very simply this: it's a measure of what we find acceptable. It's that line in the sand that you draw, that you will not cross. That's a standard. And we all have standards. You know, if something rises above our standards, we're thrilled. If something falls below our standards, we discard it. All of us, as individuals, have standards, and all of us live by those standards. Think about the restaurants that you go to, okay? What do you look for in a restaurant? You look for the quality of food, the cleanliness of the kitchen. Chances are, if you went to a restaurant today and you were coming out after eating and you looked back in the kitchen and there's this great big fat guy back there and he's got this tank top on and he's got more hair on his back than he does on his head and he's sweating and he's over the food cooking away and he's got a cigarette hanging out of his mouth, chances are you're probably not going to go back to that restaurant, are you? Because it fell below your standard. But about retail customer service, if you go into a store and they're helpful and they're quick and they're polite, they probably have risen to your standard, haven't they? But if you go into a store where the staff ignores you and they never have what you're looking for, are you going to go back to that store? No. Why? Because it fell below your standard. Everybody has standards. It doesn't matter what walk of life you're from. The problem is when you start talking about moral standards, everybody starts freaking out, especially in the church. It is amazing to me how many people have not been in the church in their life or haven't been in it in the last 20 years who seem to think they know exactly what's going on in the church. And they seem to think that we're still trying to ram our beliefs down their throats. And they have this big problem with it. They think that if you come into the church, the minute that you walk through that front door, the ushers are going to rush up to you with a list of do's and don'ts. It's like when Shrek and Donkey entered Duloc.
Where is everybody? Hey, look at this.
Welcome to Duloc, such a perfect town. Here we have some rules, let us lay them down. Don't make waves, stay in line, and we'll get along fine. Duloc is a perfect place. Please keep up on the grass, shine your shoes, wipe your face. Duloc is a perfect place.
Well, the church is not a perfect place because it has people in it, and people are not perfect. But this is the idea that some people have, and this is why it's so hard to convince people that we need to have a shared standard. Everybody, like I said, has standards, and we need to have shared standards. Canada was built on a Judeo-Christian ethic. And under the standards of that ethic, and when we talk about a Judeo-Christian ethic, we're talking about the Old Testament and the New Testament, the principles that are taught in both. The standards of the Jews, the standards of the Christians. And under those standards, that ethic, Canada became a great culture and a great country. But starting in the 60s, our political leaders began to strip away the public standards that were set by the Judeo-Christian ethic. Until today, we live in a country that has very few common standards and very little moral unity. We have become like the Jews in the days of the Judges. When in Judges 17, verse 6, it says, "And in those days there was no king in Israel, but every man did that which was right in his own eyes." That's what's happening in Canada today. Everybody is doing morally what is right in their own eyes. And as a result of that, we are more disunified than we have ever been, more divided as a culture than we have ever been in our lives. As a people, North Americans' lack of shared standards have plunged us into chaos and confusion. And the same thing happens in the church, which does not share moral code of standards. We need a shared set of moral standards in the church. Otherwise, we're all pulling apart. Somebody says, "I think it should be done this way. I want my way." Somebody else says, "I want it done this way. I think it should be done this way." What does the Word say? That's the standard. What does the Word say? If a brother and sister are fighting in the church, do we side with one and against the other, or side with this guy over here against her? No. We read the Word and we say, how do we bring reconciliation? That's the standard that needs to be met. So understand the church needs a shared moral code so that we can be unified, so that we can work together. For the individuals, having a moral compass is absolutely essential to having a functional and a satisfying life. People don't think that they need moral standards to have a satisfying life, but that's a lie that the world tells us. A code of moral standards clears up the confusion and the chaos of culture. And this is not unique to us. It's been happening throughout history. John Wesley, when he went to university, he was a preacher's kid. Now, I will tell you right now, most preachers, we all like to think that preachers' kids are sheltered, but they're not. I've never met a preacher's kid who was entirely sheltered. They may be a little naive in some things, but they are pretty worldly when it comes right down to it. They know what's going on in the world. John Wesley was a preacher's kid. He went to university. He saw things at university going on that he had never seen in the parsonage, that he had never seen with his church friends. And so John wrote to his mother, again, Susanna, who was a very wise woman. And again, Susanna had a great feel for kind of breaking theology down and helping us to understand it. And he wrote to his mother, he said, "Mom, all of these people are doing this and that and the other thing, and they're asking me to join them with it. What should I do? How do I know if it's sin for me?" And here's what Susanna wrote him back. She said this: "How would you judge the lawfulness and unlawfulness of a pleasure? Use this rule. Whatever weakens your reason, impairs the tenderness of your conscience, obscures your sight of God, takes from you your thirst for spiritual things, or increases the authority of your body over your mind, then that thing to you is evil. And by this test, you may detect evil, no matter how subtly or how plausibly temptation may be presented to you." Susanna was a very wise woman. And those are some good words for each and every one of us to live by. If you want to know if something's going to be wrong for you, you apply this. And I will tell you, it'll change the way that you live. Now, if you're one of those people who don't really have a moral code, or if you're one of those people, or you adopt the moral code of whoever you seem to be out with that night, if I'm with the Christians, I'll act and I'll talk like a Christian. If I'm not with non-Christians, I'll act and I'll talk like a non-Christian. You've got some problems. And it's no wonder that you lay awake at night. It's no wonder that you suffer from depression and discouragement and anxiety and all of these sort of things. There was a study done by Dr. William Strawbridge of the Human Population Laboratory in Berkeley, California. It's a 30-year study of 2,600 people, and it suggested that those who attended services regularly tended to smoke and drink less, take physical exercise, and maintain stable marriages, all factors in a long and healthy life. But here's the interesting thing. He said this: scientists said churchgoers had lower blood pressure, experienced less depression and anxiety, and had a stronger immune system than non-churchgoers. Now, why? Because of the shared set of moral standards. See, a shared set of moral standards will help you understand exactly who you are. If you're one of those people and you go out with whoever you're out with and you just say, "Well, I'll just adopt their moral standards for the night," you are going to be miserable in life because you have no anchor. And you're just going to drift, and you're always going to wonder, what's wrong with me? Why am I so unhappy? How come I don't know who I am? I'm this old, and I don't know who I am. Well, if you had moral standards, if you had shared moral standards, you would understand who you are. You would have an anchor to hold on to and say, I will go this far and no farther. I will not participate in this. I will participate in this. But if every time that you're going out with somebody, you're wondering, gee, I wonder what we're going to get into tonight. Yeah, it's no wonder that you're miserable. The lack of shared standards causes chaos and confusion. That's why Jesus wrote in Matthew chapter 7, anyone who hears my teaching and doesn't obey it is foolish, like a person who builds a house on the sand. And when the rains and the floods come and the winds beat against that house, it will collapse with a mighty crash. Nowhere as a pastor do I see this than when death visits a family. I have been doing this for over 35 years. I've done it in the backwoods. I've done it in cities. I've done it here. And I remember one guy that I would go out and I would talk to him about salvation, and he'd say, no, I don't need it. I don't need it. And his whole family was like that. He said, I don't need it. I don't need God. What do I need God for? I don't need God. And then he got sick. And then he died. And they asked me to do the funeral because I was the only preacher that would go out and visit him. And in the middle of that funeral, the family had absolutely no peace, absolutely no comfort. What could I say? They knew where he stood. They knew what he had told me. I remember his daughter trying to crawl into the coffin before they closed that door because she was just so depressed, so discouraged. She was just absolutely at wit's end. See, for us as Christians, a funeral is closure. A funeral is something that we go to and we're thankful for because we know where that person is gone. Funeral for a non-Christian? It's null and void. It's the end. They'll never be back. They have no hope whatsoever. Why? Because of no shared moral standards. In a functional church, a moral code that sets standards is not only taught, it is lived out and proven true. A shared set of moral standards unites a church and gives comfort to the individual Christian that they're not alone in this world. One of the things that has helped me when I have worked secular is to know this, is that when I go out with the boys after work and they get into the hijinks that they're going to get in, I can walk away from it. Why? Because I know that I have a family in the church that would do the same thing. And it gives me the strength to walk away. Not in a nasty way, not in a I'm holier than thou way. You don't do it that way. But you just say, guys, this just isn't for me. And you walk away. Why? Because you have a family in the church that you know will give you support and give you strength in that. A functional church is a place of shared moral standards which deliver the believer from the confusion and the chaos of the culture that we live in. Somebody said in the good old gospel service today, I think it was Ruth was talking about, she had a professor in university. And he had a progressive theology which said, well, every day the world's just getting better and better. And I think Ruth you're going to write him a letter and ask him how he's doing, I think, aren't you? But you and I know it's not true. The world isn't getting better and better. I was born in 59, and believe me, I've seen a lot of stuff happen. It is not getting better and better all the time. But thankfully, when we have a shared moral standard, it doesn't matter how bad the world gets because we're not going to change. God is within us, and God will help us.